The passage beneath the castle stair is narrow for a man of Wyman Manderly's size, and it has always been. His bearers tip the litter sideways at the tightest corner, the way they have learned after years of navigating his considerable weight through spaces made for smaller men. And Wyman grips the rail and says nothing. The stone here is older than anything above it. Older than the new castle with its white walls and its view of the harbour. This is the deep stone of the wolf's den, rough cut and dark, the kind of stone that remembers the days when this stretch of river mouth had no name and no city and no lord, only raiders who took what they liked and moved on. The torches in the wall brackets throw orange light and long shadows. The air smells of salt and of the cold that only lives in stone that never sees the sun. Wyman thinks of Davos Seaworth as his men carry him through the dark. The onion night is gone. Wyman had watched the hired boat push out from the harbour gate an hour past, the sail catching the wind off the bight, growing smaller against the grey water until it was nothing more than a pale fleck, and then nothing at all. Davos is headed for the Bay of Seals and for Skagos beyond it, an island the rest of the world treats as a rumour. He carries Wyman's mission. He carries the price. Wyman needs a smuggler, not a king. That is what he had told him. Bring back Rickon Stark. Bring back the last Stark lord that anyone can find. Robert Glover walks behind the litter, his footsteps quiet on the stone. Further back trails Wex Pike, the boy who cannot speak, 12 years old and sharper than any boy his age has a right to be. He had thrown a knife at a spot on Wyman's map and told them where Rickon Stark was hiding. The chalk and the board are tucked under his arm. His dark eyes take in everything. The passage ends, and the litter-bearers straighten, and Wyman breathes easier. The Wolf's Den receives them. An ancient castle, this. King Jon Stark had raised it at the mouth of the White Knife to hold the river against the men who had been raiding the lands around it for too long, and it had stood since, growing from fort to seat, to prison over the centuries. Davos Seaworth had spent his days here in the third door cell, eating what Wyman sent and waiting for whatever came next. Pardren meets them at the inner gate. Wyman's steward is a lean and careful man, 30 years in Manderly service, with the manner of someone who knows when a thing is worth interrupting a lord for, and when it is not. "My lord," Pardren says. He holds something flat in both hands, the way a man holds something he is uncertain what to make of. A piece of parchment, folded small, the paper gone soft and brown at the edges with age. "We found this clearing, the Seaworth cell. Behind the stones, lord, low in the wall near the floor. Someone moved a block and mortared it back years ago. Long years. I thought you should see it before anyone else did." Wyman looks at the parchment. Even from here he can see the wax seal. 2 sigils pressed together in old, dull wax. He knows the first of them without question. A direwolf. As familiar to him after a lifetime in the north as his own family's merman. The second is half-eaten by the years, but the shape survives. 3 heads and wings. A dragon. "Leave it with me," Wyman says. "Leave the torch." They leave him the torch and they leave him alone, and Wyman stands in the cold old stone of the Wolf's Den with a dead woman's letter in his hands. The seal is unbroken. No one has opened this. It has sat here in the dark, behind a mortared stone for 17 years, waiting. He is nearly 60 years old. His hands are thick and soft, and better suited to a ledger than a castle wall, and they do not tremble. He breaks the seal. He unfolds the parchment with the attention of a man who understands that some things, once unfolded, do not go back. The handwriting is a young woman's. Careful at first, the letters shaped with deliberate precision. then faster as the lines go down the page, faster and harder, as if the woman writing could not get the words out quickly enough. He reads. She writes of the tower in the red mountains of dawn. She names it, and she names the 3 knights in white cloaks who stood guard at its door. Gerald Hightower, who was Lord Commander of the King's Guard, and Arthur Dane, who men called the Sword of the Morning, and Oswell Went. She writes that those 3 knights were there when she arrived, and still there when she understood she would not be leaving. She writes of the man she loved, not as the songs describe him, with the silver hair and the harp and the borrowed laurel crown. She describes the way he spoke to her in the low hours of the night. She writes that he wept the evening she told him she was with child. She calls him Rhaegar without title and says he was killed at the Trident before he could know if she lived through the birth. She writes that what was between them was not what the world calls it. She writes that they were married before a septon, that witnesses were present, that the union is recorded in the books of the faith at a place she names. She writes the child's name. She writes it twice, as if saying it aloud to no one. She writes, "My brother Ned will come for me. He always comes. By the time someone reads this, I will be past reading. If it is not Ned who finds this, let it be someone who knows what an old debt is. Give the boy to Ned. Let him grow up with a name that does not put a sword to his throat the day he is born. Robert must never know. The last lines are barely legible. The handwriting breaks apart. She was dying when she wrote this. The letters press too hard, and then go light as breath, and then stop. Promise me, she has written. Nothing after. Wyman reads it twice. He reads it a 3rd time, slower. He is enormously fat. He cannot ride a horse. He is carried everywhere in a litter by men who have grown strong in his service. His son Wylis is home now, back from Lannister captivity, and Wyman had wept in private when the gate opened and Wylis walked through it. His other son, Wendell, will not walk through any gate again. Wendell died at the Twins with a crossbow quarrel through the back of his head and out of his mouth, shot at a wedding, killed for trusting a host's roof. His bones rest in the Sept of the Snows here in White Harbor. Wyman visits them when his body allows it. He thinks of Wendell now. He thinks of the debt. It is old, the debt. Older than Wyman, older than his father. Lord Lorimar Peake drove the Manderlys out of everything they had in the south, out of the Mander and its riverlands and all the life they had built there over generations. The Manderlys had had nowhere to go and nothing left. The Starks had said, "Come north." The Starks had given them the Wolf's Den and the lands at the mouth of the White Knife and asked only for oaths in return. Everything Wyman has, his family has, was built on that gift. The white walls, the new castle on the hill, the harbour full of ships. He pushes himself upright with the help of 2 of his bearers and moves to the Wolf's Den's narrow window and looks out at White Harbor. The harbor is full of ships. 23 he can count from this window, their masts bare, their hulls sitting low and patient. War galleys, built over the past year in secret, a purpose kept from King's Landing and from Winterfell and from every Frey and Bolton spy who had ever thought Wyman Manderly was craven and loyal and harmless. More ships ride at anchor further up the White Knife, past the rapids, where the river runs narrow and eyes do not reach easily. He had built them because he knew the day would come when the North would need them. He looks at those ships for a long time. He thinks of Rickon Stark, 5 years old, somewhere on Skagos with a wildling woman and a direwolf and no idea that anyone remembers him. Davos will bring him back. When Rickon comes home, if Winterfell is ever Stark again, the boy will be 6, perhaps 7. A child who will need years and regents before he can hold anything together. It is not nothing. Wyman has never thought it was nothing. A Stark child lord is better than a Bolton in the seat. But the thing folded inside his robe against his chest changes the weight of everything. Jon Snow is 17 years old, and he is standing at the wall. Wyman knows what the world knows about Jon Snow, the bastard of Winterfell. Ned Stark's bastard, born of some nameless woman from the war, sent north to the Night's Watch to wear black and take no throne and hold no lands and trouble no one. He has seen the boy twice, years back, at feasts and councils. Grey eyes, long face, every line of him a Stark. But the letter in his robe says something else about those lines. The letter says the boy's mother was 16 years old and dying in a tower in Dorne, and she called what she and Rhaegar had between them a marriage. Robb Stark named him heir. Wyman had heard it from men whose seals were on the decree. King Robb had legitimized Jon Snow and named him his heir before the twins took everything. That decree exists somewhere, and if it can be found, between it and this letter, the North would have a Stark who is also something more. Not a child on a dangerous island, a man of 17, already commanding the wall, already in the very place the fleet would need to reach. Wyman turns from the window. He does not burn the letter. The thought does not come to him, any more than the thought of burning Wendell's bones had come to him when the Freys carted them south as if they were doing him a favor. Some things you do not burn. Some things you carry. He folds the parchment along its old creases, careful and deliberate. He tucks it inside his robe and presses his hand flat over it. Lighter than he expected. 17 years of a secret. It weighs almost nothing at all. He calls for Glover. Robert Glover comes in quickly, with the manner of a man who has been standing just outside the door. He takes in Wyman's expression, and something careful shifts behind his eyes. Robert, Wyman says. He does not look at him. He is looking at the harbour, at the galleys that have been waiting for a purpose since Wendell died. The ship's up the White Knife. How long to bring all of them down to the harbour? Glover thinks about it. 3 days, my lord. 4 if the wind turns against us. Wyman nods once. His hand stays flat against the letter. Then we had best begin tonight, he says. The solar is warm. Someone has built up the fire against the winter chill off the harbour, and the room smells of wood smoke and candle tallow and the sea salt that works its way into everything in White Harbour, regardless of what you do to stop it. Wyman's chair is at the head of the table, wide enough for him, built for the specific purpose of holding his specific weight without complaint. He lowers himself into it and breathes. Wireless is already there when he arrives. Wyman's heir sits with his hands flat on the table and his back straight, the careful posture of a man newly home from a long and difficult absence. He has been back 3 weeks, and the pallor of Lannister captivity has not fully left his face. He says nothing when Wyman enters. He looks at his father's expression, and he waits. Robert Glover arrives a few minutes later. He is tall, with the deeply lined face of a man who has spent too many years carrying other men's problems, and brown-grey hair that he keeps close-cropped in the northern fashion. He closes the door behind him and stands rather than sitting, the way he always does when he knows something important is about to be said. Wyman takes the letter from inside his robe and sets it on the table. Neither man reaches for it. Glover looks at the broken seal, the 2 pressed sigils, and his expression doesn't change. Wireless looks at his father. "Read it," Wyman says to Glover. Glover reads it. He stands over the table, and he reads it through without comment, without his face giving him away, the way he has learned in years of plots and counsels and watching. Then he sets it back on the table, and he straightens. Where did it come from? The cell where Davos Seaworth slept, behind a stone in the lower wall. It was placed there 17 years ago and mortared back in. No one has touched it since. Glover is quiet for a long moment. It could be a forgery. It could be, Wyman agrees. It is also very detailed. The names of the 3 Kingsguard at that tower, the exact place in Dawn, the specific records of the faith where the Union is described to be recorded. Someone who wanted to forge this would have needed to know a great deal. Someone who wanted to forge this would have had 17 years to learn it. True, Wyman says. All the same. Wylis reaches out and takes the letter. He reads it without asking permission. His father watches him read it. When he sets it down, something has shifted in his careful, composed face. Glover laces his hands together. "We agreed to get the Stark boy from Skagos. The Onion Knight is already at sea. That was the price, and he paid it. And now we are proposing to change everything because of a piece of old parchment found in a prison wall." "We are not changing everything," Wyman says. "Davos is still sailing for Skagos. That does not change. When he brings Rickon home, if he brings him home, Rickon will be 6 or 7 years old. He will need regents and wardships and years before he can say his own name in council without someone speaking over him. I have nothing against the boy. He is a Stark, and I would die for a Stark. But the letter in front of you does not describe a child on an island." He sets his hand flat on the parchment. "It describes a man of 17, standing at the wall right now, with the Night's Watch around him. Robb named him his heir before the twins. Bannerman sealed that decree. Jon Snow is legitimate by Robb's own word, and by this letter he is something more than a northern heir." He pauses to let that settle. He is the son of the last crown prince of the Targaryen dynasty, born in lawful marriage. Tell me where that sits in the order of succession. Glover stares at the letter. Stannis is at Castle Black. He is. Bolton is in Winterfell. He is. And he will still be in Winterfell when we arrive to remove him. The door opens. Willa does not knock. She has never knocked. She is 15, perhaps 16, and she moves through the world as if the world's obstacles are interesting problems rather than reasons to stop. Her braid is dyed the green of deep harbour water, the blonde of her actual hair visible at her eyebrows, which are drawn together now in the particular expression she wears when she is done listening from a corridor. "Then let us do what we promised," she says. She looks at Wyman, not at Glover, not at her father. Her voice is thin and high and utterly certain. The North remembers. That is what we say to each other. Let it mean something. Wyman looks at his granddaughter for a moment. He remembers her standing in the merman's court not long past, in front of every lord and Frey guest in the hall, saying exactly what she thought about what this family owed and did not owe. She had been told to be quiet. She had not been quiet. He had not, in the end, been able to find it in himself to be angry about it. "You will sail with us," he says. She blinks. She was ready for argument and did not get it. A small thing happens in her expression, something young and surprised, and then very quickly put away. She nods, turns and goes, leaving the door open behind her. Wyman calls for the master. The first letter takes some thought. He dictates it carefully, picking the words. It goes to the Lord of Greywater Watch, in the neck, addressed to Lord Howland Reed. He writes that a letter has been found in White Harbour, in the Wolf's Den, behind a mortared stone. He writes that the letter is signed and sealed by a woman who died at the Tower of Joy in 283. He describes what the letter claims, and he asks, plainly, whether the events described in it are true. He asks Reed to confirm or deny what happened at that tower and what he witnessed there. He does not write what he intends to do with the answer. The second letter is shorter. It goes to Castle Black, to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. It says, "A fleet is sailing north. Make no announcements until it arrives. The North remembers its debts. Both ravens go out before the hour is done. The riders follow. They go north along the White Knife Road at a hard gallop, carrying orders for the captains of the galleys anchored past the rapids in the hidden stretches of the river. Bring every ship down to the harbour. Begin tonight. Leave nothing upriver." Wyman watches from the new castle's hilltop, where he can see both harbours spread out below him, and the bight beyond, and the pale winter sky over everything. The city moves at its ordinary pace below him, merchants and fishermen and dockhands going about their work, none of them knowing yet what the fat old lord on the hill has put into motion. He has spent years being the craven lord of White Harbour, too timid and too loyal to give anyone cause for alarm. He has spent years being underestimated in ways that served him. That is finished now. The moment he sends a fleet north, everyone will know exactly what he is. He finds he does not mind. The answer from Greywater Watch comes the next morning at first light, faster than it has any right to arrive, as if the words had been waiting at the edge of the neck for someone to ask the question. Wyman reads the Raven in his bedchamber, still in his sleeping robe, his pale white hair loose around his shoulders. The message is short. The handwriting is steady and unhurried. What you have found is true. The child lived. The Tower of Joy was real. I was there. He reads it twice. He sets it on the nightstand beside Lyanna's letter, and he looks at the two of them side by side in the early light. Two pieces of parchment. One from a dying girl in a tower in dawn. One from a man who has lived 17 years in the swamps of the Neck with a secret he has told no one. Two voices saying the same thing. He calls for his bearers. It takes time to dress a man of his size and get him into his litter and carry him down through the new castle and out through the gates and down the castle stair toward the harbour. By the time he reaches the docks, the sun is clear of the horizon, and the harbour is alive with work. His galleys are moving. He can hear the captains calling from ship to ship, the ropes singing, and the hulls groaning as the crews make ready. Willa is already at the flagship's rail when his bearers carry him up the gangplank. Her green braid catches the morning wind. She does not say anything. She does not need to. Wyman settles into the chair lashed to the deck for his use, and he presses one hand flat to his chest over the two letters tucked inside his robe. Around him, the sailors move with purpose. The harbour fills with the sound of oars being shipped. The North remembers. He has said it so many times, in so many rooms, for so many years, that the words have become as ordinary as breathing. Today they are not ordinary. He thinks, it is time. Jon Snow is 17 years old, and he has not slept well in a week. He stands at the top of the wall before dawn, alone, looking south. The land below the ice stretches out grey and cold and enormous under a sky that has not decided yet whether it is night or morning. He has stood here before on nights he could not sleep. He has stood here more times than he can count since the Watch elected him to command it. The cold does not bother him the way it bothers men from the south. He is a Stark, or near enough. He was raised in snow. He goes back down the steps and returns to Castle Black when the sky begins to lighten, and by the time he reaches his solar, the morning's reports are already waiting. The situation at the wall is the situation it has been for weeks. The wildlings are through and settled in the gift, some of them, the ones who swore to him, and his brothers walk around them with their jaws tight and their hands never far from their weapons. The watch is half what it should be, and what it has is not enough. Lord Stannis Baratheon sits in the king's tower with his banners and his fire priestess and his plans, and Jon walks the thin line between all of it, owing something to everyone, and enough to no one. 2 days ago, the letter from Ramsay Bolton arrived. It is not the kind of letter a man forgets once he has read it. It is the kind of letter that makes a man understand, very clearly, that the world will not wait for him to be ready. Ramsay Bolton claims what he claims, and threatens what he threatens, and Jon knows what is happening at Winterfell, or some of it. He had sent a man there. He had sent the king beyond the wall south in secret in another man's skin to pull a girl out of the place where she was being kept. It had been Jon's decision. It had been Jon's mission to authorize, and Jon's problem if it went wrong. And the letter says it has gone very wrong. Jon is the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. He wears no crowns and wins no glory. That is the vow he swore and the life he chose. But the letter sits on his table and does not care about his vows. The raven from White Harbour arrives at midday. Bowen Marsh brings it to him, which Jon suspects is deliberate. The Lord Steward of the Night's Watch is not a man given to symbolic gestures, but he sets the message on the table beside Ramsay's letter, and he waits, and his waiting means something. Jon reads the message. A fleet is sailing north. Make no announcements until it arrives. The North remembers its debts. It is signed by the Lord of White Harbour. Jon reads it twice. He looks at the seal, the Manderly merman, pressed in wax. He tries to make it mean something simple, and it will not. Wyman Manderly is the fattest lord in the North, and the most cautious and the most loyal to whatever power his sons' lives depend on. That Manderly would sail a fleet anywhere without being asked is strange. That he would sail it north is stranger. That he would write to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch to announce it, in language that sounds like a warning and a promise at once, is the strangest thing Jon has heard in a week full of strange things. He knows Manderly by reputation, the fat lord of White Harbour, the lord who fed the Stark cause when everyone was watching, who swore to Robb when Robb was still a king. He thinks of Robb and puts the thought away. He takes the letter to Stannis. The king's tower is warm, warmer than the rest of Castle Black, because Stannis's men have kept a fire burning in it for months. Stannis stands at the window when Jon comes in. He is lean and dark, the kind of man who wears his age in the lines of his face rather than in softness, and his close-cropped black hair has been going grey at the temples since Jon first saw him. His jaw is the jaw of a man who has been grinding his teeth against the world for 36 years. His eyes are cold and blue, and they miss very little. He reads Manderly's Raven without asking Jon's permission to do so, which Jon expected. He reads it and sets it down and looks at Jon. He agreed to send Davos for the boy, Stannis says. Rickon Stark, that was the arrangement. This is not the arrangement. No, Jon says. He is sailing his fleet north instead of honouring his word. That is what this says. He says a fleet is coming. He does not say why. He says not to announce anything until it arrives. Stannis's jaw works. I have no interest in waiting for Wyman Manderly to explain himself. We have a Bolton in Winterfell, and an army that needs to move before the deep winter locks the roads. If Manderly has decided to play his own game instead of ours, that is his failure and his problem. We march. Not yet, Jon says. Stannis stares at him. You want Winterfell and the Boltons gone, Jon says. So do I. But if Manderly is sailing his fleet north without being asked, he has a reason. He does not do things without reasons. Give it 3 days. Let the fleet reach us. Hear what he is carrying before we commit to anything. The silence in the room is the particular silence of a man who is deciding whether he is going to say something he will regret. You are the Lord Commander, Stannis says finally. His voice makes it sound like an accusation. Do as you think best. He turns back to the window, and he does not look at Jon again. Jon takes the raven and goes. Bowen Marsh is waiting in the corridor outside. He is the Lord Steward of the Night's Watch, and he has served the watch for more years than Jon has been alive, and his expression when he looks at Jon contains something that is almost disappointment, and almost resentment, and almost fear, all three of them living together in the same face. Lord Commander, he says, the men are asking. There was talk of a march, the Bolton letter, now a raven from White Harbour, and a delay. The men are asking what is happening. Tell them a fleet is sailing north, and we are going to hear what it brings before we do anything else, Jon says. A fleet? Marsh says it as if the word is in a foreign language. Manderly's fleet? Yes. This is not a watch matter, my lord. None of this is a watch matter. The Bolton letter is not a watch matter. The wildlings are not a watch matter. And now a fleet from White Harbour is not a watch matter. 3 days, Bowen, Jon says. That is all I'm asking. Marsh looks at him for a moment longer. Then he nods, once, and he walks away down the corridor, and Jon watches him go, and he understands, the way he has understood for months, that Bowen Marsh's patience has a shape and a limit, and that he is getting closer to both. He goes to the Godswood when the day's work is done. Castle Black has a small Godswood, not much more than a ring of weirwoods around an open space of frozen ground, but it is quiet, and it is his, and he has come here often. He sits on the cold ground beside the heart tree, and he looks at the red leaves and the white bark, and the carved face with its hollow eyes, the way the old gods have always looked, patient and watchful, and entirely without comfort. He thinks of Ned Stark. He has thought of Ned Stark every day since the man died with his head on the steps of the great sept of Baelor. He thinks of him now the way he always thinks of him, which is the way you think about something you lost before you fully understood what it was. Ned had never spoken to Jon about his mother. Not once. Not when Jon had asked. Not when Jon had needed it. Not ever. Ned had carried that particular silence his entire life and had taken it to his grave. And Jon had learned to stop asking and to stop expecting and to fill the space where that answer should have been with whatever the wall offered instead. He does not know why a fleet is sailing north. He does not know what Wyman Manderly thinks he owes the Night's Watch, or what debt is old enough to put 20 ships at sea in winter. He says the vow to himself in the quiet of the Godswood. Not because he has forgotten it, because lately it has started to sound less like a promise and more like a door he closed behind himself without checking what was on the other side. No wife, no lands, no children, no crowns, no glory. The heart tree looks at him with its painted eyes and says nothing. The wind off the wall is cold and clean and smells of the high places where nothing grows. 3 days, Jon tells himself. Then he will know what the fleet carries. Then he will know what the North remembers. He is not sure, sitting here in the dark, that he wants to know. The galleys began moving on the second day. Not all at once. Wyman had been clear about that. One ship at a time, pulled from its anchorage in the outer harbour, and walked by oar into the inner harbour, where the shelter was better and the manoeuvring room was tighter, where the wolf's den loomed over the water, and the jetty wall blocked the worst of the wind off the bight. A single galley moving in a harbour the size of White Harbour's drew no particular attention. 2 galleys were a coincidence. 23 galleys moved one at a time. Across 2 days were 23 coincidences, and the ships hidden upriver on the White Knife were brought down in the nights that followed, crew by crew, dark hulls against darker water. Wyman had managed larger deceptions than this. He was by now quite practiced. The city had eyes that reported to Winterfell. He knew this the way he knew the dimensions of his own hall, not because anyone had told him, but because he had been paying careful attention for long enough that the pattern had become visible. A merchant who asked the wrong questions. A harbour clerk whose accounts were submitted to a lord who was not Wyman Manderly. A man who appeared in the lower city twice a month on no obvious business, and departed afterward with a particular directness of purpose. Wyman had not moved against any of them. Moving against them would have revealed that he knew, and knowing was more useful than acting most of the time. Now the time for knowing had passed. He could not stop the city's eyes from seeing the galleys move. What he could do was make certain the fleet was at sea before any rider on the fastest horse could carry the news to Winterfell and back. The road from White Harbour to Winterfell was long, and the winter had made it longer. The bight was cold, but it was open water. Ships moved faster than horses in a northern winter, and Wyman intended to use that advantage to its limit. He held a feast that evening in the great hall of the new castle. He was magnificent at it. He had spent a year being magnificent at feasts, a year of eating and laughing and lifting his cup and praising the men who had killed his son, and the lord who had stolen the north, and the king who sat 1,000 miles south on a throne of swords, and thought that settled anything. He was enormous in his chair at the head of the table, his belly pressing against the board, his fingers wrapped around a cup he refilled often and drained completely. He told stories. He laughed at other men's stories. He called for more pies and praised the cook and complained cheerfully about his gout. He was the lord of White Harbour, fat and slow and harmless, with no more ambition than his next meal, and no more edge than a man who has been comfortable for too long to remember what discomfort felt like. He gave nothing away. He was still giving nothing away when the feast ended and the hall emptied and the servants put out the torches, one by one, until only the fire in the great hearth remained. He sat in the dark for a time, his cup empty, and listened to the harbour. Earlier that day, before the feast, he had dispatched a man westward through the Wolf's Wood. Not a letter. A letter was useless here. Greywater Watch did not receive ravens. The castle of Howland Reed sat somewhere in the neck on a crannog that moved with the tides and the seasons, built on a floating island that could not be pinned to any map, that could not be found by anyone who was not meant to find it. Ravens couldn't find it. Enemies could not find it. That was, as Wyman understood it, rather the point. A raven sent to Howland Reed would fly in circles until it died. So he had sent a man. The man was one of his household riders, lean and weathered, someone who knew how to travel in winter and how to move quietly through country that was not quite safe, and how to ask directions without explaining why he needed them. He carried no written message, another precaution in a season where precautions were the only currency worth spending. He carried only words, committed to memory, for the ears of the Lord of Greywater Watch. Words about a letter. Words about a boy. words about what Wyman Manderly intended to do and what he needed confirmed, and why the man whose name was Howland Reed was the only living person who could provide that confirmation. The rider had gone at midday, and Wyman did not expect to hear from him for some time. The neck was not close. On the second afternoon, Willa stopped on the castle stair between two of the marble mermaids, their whale oil flames guttering in the wind off the harbour, and watched the inner harbour below. The galleys were moving, being walked from the outer harbour into the inner harbour, one by one, with a purpose that had not been there the day before. She had grown up with this harbour. She knew the difference between ordinary work and something else. She thought about her grandfather's face at the feast, the laughter that had been exactly right and therefore wrong. She had seen him genuinely cheerful, and she had seen him perform it, and she had learned to tell the difference long ago. She went back inside without finishing her errand and said nothing to anyone. She was 15 or 16 and was not asked her opinion on things that mattered. But she understood, standing on those stairs, that something had been decided, something that did not come with a chance to reconsider. She hoped, going back up the steps, that he knew what he was doing. She thought he probably did. On the third morning, before the sun had fully cleared the bight, the fleet went to sea. Wyman stood at the harbour wall to watch them go. He could not stand without support in the usual sense. His legs bore his weight, but his legs required help bearing themselves, and so he had a man on either side of him, and his great hands braced against the stone of the wall, and he stood in that fashion and watched his galleys file through the gap in the jetty toward the open water beyond. 23 war galleys and the ships from the White Knife behind them, and the cold morning light catching their oars as the oars rose and fell, carrying them out toward the bight. The water was grey, and the sky was grey, and the masts were dark against all of it, and the gulls that had perched along the jetty wall rose as the ships passed, and cried their indifferent cries, and settled back again. He thought of Wendell. He thought of his son with the crossbow bolt in his throat, at a feast where the laws of gods and men had said he was safe, at a table where he had sat as a guest and trusted his host in the way that guests trust hosts, and should be able to trust them and cannot always. He thought of the moment the news had reached White Harbour, the particular quality of that silence before the household understood what the words meant. He had sat in a chair by a window, a different window than the one he used now, in a different room. But the harbour had been the same harbour, and the galleys had not yet existed, and he had made himself very still and very quiet, and had decided what he would do. He had kept that decision in a locked room for a long time. He was letting it out now. He thought of Robb Stark, who had been a boy of 16 when the Freys and the Boltons made their work of him at the Twins, 16 years old, king in the north, proclaimed by the lords of the north in a great hall not so different from Wyman's own, and dead before his 17th year. A boy. They had called him the young wolf and meant it as respect, and then they had killed him at a wedding and worn his crown afterward. 16 years old. He thought of a girl who had written a letter 17 years ago in a tower in the mountains of Dawn, who had been afraid for her child and had written down the fear in her careful hand, who had trusted a stranger to carry the fear north toward the sea. The last galley cleared the jetty and turned into the wind. The farce, Wyman thought, the long and grinding performance of it, the year of smiling and eating and waiting, was done. He had played the fat fool to his absolute limit. He had no more left in him. Whatever came next would come without the mask on, and that was a relief so profound it felt almost like grief. the way the end of a long illness sometimes does when the illness finally breaks. He let his men help him back to his litter. Behind him, the harbour was empty and quiet, and White Harbour went about its morning business with the particular unconcerned efficiency of a city that had not yet learned what its lord had just done. It would learn soon enough. Cities always did. The fleet was already beyond the mouth of the Bight, and it was not coming back empty. The rider comes in from Eastwatch before noon, and the news he carries is not unexpected. More than 20 ships have been spotted, rounding the headland from the south, sailing north along the coast. Manderly's colours. They are headed for Eastwatch Harbour. Stannis Baratheon reads the report in the King's Tower, and doesn't let his face show anything. He is 36 years old, and he has been grinding his jaw against the world since before his teeth were fully in, and he has learned, over the years, that the moments when men see what you are thinking are the moments that destroy you. He sets the report on the table, and he looks out the window at the wall. He already knew the fleet existed. He had heard about it in pieces, from agents, and from the Freys who came to White Harbour looking for confirmation of Manderly's loyalty, and found what Manderly wanted them to find. Wyman. Manderly had been building ships in secret. The same ships were supposed to be Stannis' ally, coming north only after Rickon Stark arrived safely at White Harbour, and the debt was paid and the arrangement honoured. The arrangement was not being honoured. Manderly was sending the fleet north before Davos had even reached Skagos. Stannis folds the report and puts it in his robe. He stands at the window for a long time. The wall catches the pale winter light and throws it back, cold and indifferent. He thinks about Wyman Manderly, who is old and fat and cunning, and has spent the last year pretending to be none of the last three things. He thinks about what a man who had been pretending to be a coward for a year would choose to do when he decided to stop pretending. He would not do something small. He would not do something cautious. He would do exactly this: put everything on a ship and send it north without announcing why. There is something on that fleet, something Manderly found that changed the calculation. Stannis thinks about what that something might be. He thinks about Robert. Robert Baratheon has been dead for 2 years, killed by a boar in a forest outside King's Landing because he drank too much and hunted with a dulled sword. And what he left behind was a throne Stannis has been trying to claim ever since. Robert built his dynasty on a war. The war had a cause. The cause was Lyanna Stark. Stannis knew Robert as well as anyone knew Robert, which was to say that he knew the shape of the man's rage, and the shape of the man's grief, and the way the two of them were the same shape. Robert had loved Lyanna Stark. Robert had believed that Rhaegar stole her, that the crown prince had taken a betrothed woman by force and hidden her in a tower in Dorne until she died there. Robert had gone to war over that belief, and Robert had won. And everything that followed, the throne, the dynasty, the 17 years of a reign, rested on the truth of it: Robert's rebellion. Stannis thinks that phrase now and hears something in it he has never quite examined. What if the rebellion was not what Robert believed it was? What if the girl went willingly? What if the tower was not a prison? What if Rhaegar did not steal her, but she left with him, and the war was fought for a story that was not the story? Stannis does not waste time on hypotheticals as a rule. He deals in facts and laws and what can be proven. But he is also a man who follows a line of reasoning wherever it goes, regardless of whether he wants to arrive at the end of it. And the end of this line is standing somewhere in Castle Black right now, 17 years old, with Ned Stark's face and his mother's secret in his blood. He goes to find Jon Snow. Jon is in the yard when Stannis finds him, overseeing something. Stannis does not pay much attention to the watch's internal arrangements, but he registers that Jon moves through the yard with the particular ease of someone who knows exactly where everything is and what everything weighs. He is young. Stannis has told himself that several times since arriving at the Wall, as if youth were an argument against competence, which he knows from his own history. It is not. Jon Snow has dark grey hair and grey eyes, and a long face that looks precisely like every Stark Stannis has ever seen. He looks nothing like a Targaryen. That particular bloodline runs to silver and purple, to the sharp-boned, otherworldly beauty that Rhaegar wore the way other men wear armor. This boy looks like he was built in Winterfell out of the same stone as the rest of them. He looks, in fact, like the kind of man you would send to the Wall rather than the kind of man you would put on a throne. And Stannis wonders now, with Manderly's fleet at Eastwatch, whether that has been the whole point. Manderly is not bringing Rickon, Stannis says, when Jon turns to face him. He agreed to retrieve Rickon. That was our arrangement. What is he bringing instead? Jon looks at him without flinching, which Stannis notes. I told you 2 days ago that a fleet was coming. I told you I didn't know why. I still don't know why. You have a guess. I have questions. No answers. Stannis studies him. The grey eyes look back at Stannis and do not look away. There is nothing of Robert in this face. There is nothing of Rhaegar in it either, at least not at first glance. There is Stark all the way down, and Stannis has looked at enough men in his life to know when a face is telling the truth. Manderly has been building that fleet for a year, Stannis says. He built it in secret. He maintained the appearance of a craven lord of a minor northern city, right up until the day he stopped maintaining it. Men who maintain appearances that carefully for that long do it because they are waiting for something specific, something they knew was coming. He pauses. He is not a foolish man. He is not a man who sails a fleet north without a reason that is worth the risk. Jon says nothing. He waits. Jon Snow, Stannis says. His voice is careful, flat, the voice he uses when he wants to give nothing away. Before Jeor Mormont died, did he ever speak to you of your parentage? Jon goes still for a moment. It is a small thing, the kind of stillness a man falls into when a question arrives from a direction he did not expect. No, he says. My lord. Never. Stannis nods once. He looks at Jon for another moment. Then he turns and walks back toward the king's tower. He does not say another word. Jon stands in the yard and watches him go. He watches the lean, dark figure climb the steps and go through the door, and the door close behind him. And he stands there in the cold wind, and he thinks about the question. Before Jeor Mormont died, did he ever speak to you of your parentage? Not your mother, not your father, your parentage. Jon has heard the word used to describe the investigation of a man's blood and birth, and the rights and properties that flow from those things. It is a word that matters when titles and claims are involved. It is not a word a man uses to ask about a bastard's nameless mother. It is the word you use when you are asking about a line of succession. Something is coming on that fleet. Something Stannis already suspects and will not say, and something Jon does not know and is starting to understand. He does not know. Bowen Marsh finds him a few minutes later with the afternoon reports. The Wall needs attention, regardless of what is approaching from the south. There are sections of ice that need inspection, and supplies that need accounting, and brothers who need assignments. And Jon listens to all of it, and responds to all of it, and holds the shape of his command together the way he has been holding it since the Watch elected him, through everything. He is good at it. He has gotten better at it. He is not sure any more whether he is holding it together for its own sake, or because it is the only thing he knows how to do. One more day, he tells himself. The fleet will be at Eastwatch by tomorrow. One more day, and he will know what Stannis suspects, and Manderly is carrying, and the North remembers. The wall came out of the grey sky like a verdict. Wyman had seen it before, years ago, on a progress north undertaken out of duty rather than curiosity. He had not expected to be moved by it, and he had been moved anyway. By the sheer fact of the thing, the way it existed at a scale that made everything else seem provisional. He was a different man now, coming to it with different purpose, and the wall looked different through the eyes of a man sailing toward the thing that defines the rest of his life. The Bay of Seals opened before the fleet in the grey morning light. The shore was windswept and cold, the kind of cold that had intention behind it, and the castle at the wall's eastern end crouched on the shore where the ice met the sea. Small by the standards of great castles, but solid and alive. Lights in the towers. Men on the walls. A harbour of sorts, rougher than white harbours, built for function rather than beauty, where several nights' watch galleys rode at anchor, and the black-cloaked men on the docks moved with the efficient unhurry of people who have learned not to waste effort in extreme weather. The fleet anchored in the bay, and the boats went ashore. Wyman went last, because he went in his litter, and the litter required care in a small boat. He had made his peace with the fact that very little involving his body was dignified any more. The important thing was that it worked. And it worked. And he arrived on the shore, dry and upright, and still in possession of the letter. The commander of Eastwatch met them at the waterline. He was a hard man, scarred in ways that suggested he had not arrived at his position by accident, and he looked at the fleet in the bay with the expression of a man who has seen many unexpected things and has learned to evaluate them before reacting to them. "Lord Manderly," he said, "we had no word you were coming." "No," Wyman agreed pleasantly. "You wouldn't have. Is the Lord Commander alive?" Something shifted in the man's face. Not surprise exactly, more the recognition that the question had arrived at the right moment. "He is. Barely when they brought him down from Castle Black. Less barely now." A pause. He is not well, my lord. He was stabbed multiple times. The Maester says he should not have survived. And yet, Wyman repeated. He felt something in his chest settle that had been tense for days. "I would like to see him." They brought him inland in the litter, through the castle, and into a low building where fires were kept burning, and the air smelled of smoke and pine resin, and the particular sharpness of a Maester's medicines. The room they put him in was small, because Eastwatch's rooms were all small, and the litter barely fit, and Wyman had to sit at an angle and hold his breath to squeeze through the doorway, which he did without comment. Jon Snow was in the bed. Wyman had prepared himself for this moment in the way he prepared himself for most things, by thinking through it carefully in advance, anticipating what he would feel, deciding in advance how to manage it. He had thought about what it would mean to see this boy, knowing what he knew. He had thought he was ready. He was not entirely ready. The boy was 16 or 17 years old, slight and dark in the way of the Starks. Dark hair, grey eyes that looked at Wyman from the pillow with the wary intelligence of someone who has learned not to trust surprise visitors. He was pale from blood loss, and his breathing was careful. The way breathing is careful when certain movements cause certain kinds of pain. His face was young. It was a young face, carrying more than young faces should ordinarily carry, and it was, unmistakably, a Stark face. The grey eyes, the particular set of the jaw, the look in them that said, I have seen hard things, and I am not afraid of hard things, and I am still evaluating whether you are a hard thing." He looked like Ned. He also looked, and this was the thing Wyman had not prepared for, like the girl whose name was at the bottom of a letter. Something fierce in the eyes, something that had not yet been worn down by the world's persistent effort to wear it down. "Lord Manderly," Jon said. His voice was steady. He was holding himself still with the discipline of someone who has been told that moving hurts and who has taken the advice seriously. "You have come a long way." "I have," Wyman said. "How are you feeling?" "Like a man who was stabbed several times." A pause. "I am told I should thank someone for still being alive. I am not yet certain who." "We will work that out," Wyman said. "I have something for you to see. I am going to ask you to look at it carefully before you say anything, and then I am going to ask you to think before you respond. I have learned in 60 years that this is the best approach to things that are very large and very unexpected." Jon watched him. The grey eyes were patient, which was a mercy, because what Wyman did next took time. He reached into the case that his man held for him and brought out the letter, carefully, as he always handled it, and unfolded it, and held it up where Jon could see it without having to move. "I will read it to you," Wyman said. "You should know that I have read it many times, and I believe it is true, and I believe it changes everything. But I will read it first, and then you can decide for yourself what you believe." He read it. He read it slowly, in the small room, with the fire at the wall and the wind off the Bay of Seals pressing against the stones outside, and he watched Jon Snow's face as he read. He had learned to watch faces. He had spent a year watching the faces of men who were lying to him and making himself appear not to notice. What he watched now was something entirely different, a face in the process of receiving information that rearranged the world it had been organized around. Jon said nothing while Wyman read. He lay still. His grey eyes were open and fixed on the ceiling, and then on Wyman, and then on the ceiling again. His hands, visible above the blanket, were very still. When Wyman finished, he folded the letter and waited. The silence lasted long enough to become its own kind of answer. Then Jon said, "She named him." "She did. She named Rhaegar Targaryen." "Yes." Another silence. Outside, wind. The fire worked at the cold and did not entirely win. "Ned," Jon said. It was not quite a question, and not quite a statement. It was the sound of a name being held up and looked at from a new angle. "Ned raised me. Ned claimed me as his. He did. He carried you north from the mountains of Dawn, and raised you in Winterfell, and called you his bastard, and never told you." Wyman's voice was not unkind. He had thought about how to say this too. "I cannot tell you what he was thinking. I can only tell you what she wrote. She was afraid for you. She was dying, and she was afraid, and she trusted someone to carry this north, and it took 17 years for it to arrive. And Ned Stark kept his promise, whatever the promise was, and you grew up not knowing." Jon was quiet for a long time. "I do not know," he finally said, "what I am supposed to do with this." "You don't have to know yet," Wyman said. "You are alive. That is enough for today." He held the letter. "There is a man coming, a Lord of the Neck who was present at the Tower of Joy in 283 AC, who was there when your mother died. He is the only living person who can confirm what this letter says from his own memory. He is coming because I sent for him. When he arrives, you will have more than a piece of paper. You will have a witness." Jon looked at him. The grey Stark eyes, steady and wary and not yet decided about anything. "And then?" he asked. "And then," Wyman said, "we will see what the North has to say about it." He left the boy with the letter. He had decided, somewhere on the bight with the waves working against the hull, that the letter should stay with Jon. It was his. It had always been his. A dead woman's gift to a son she had been afraid for, the only thing she could give him, delayed by 17 years, and a locked chest in a warehouse. It was long past time it reached its intended recipient. He was brought back out into the cold of the Bay of Seals, back to his litter, back to the process of being a very large man in a very small world, and he sat there in the cold wind and looked at the wall above him, white and impossible, and felt the particular satisfaction of a thing that has been in motion for a long time and has finally arrived where it was going. Jon Snow was alive. He was alive, and he had the letter, and he had grey eyes like every Stark who had ever lived, and the North remembered, and the mummer's farce was done, and what came next would come without a mask on. That was enough. For now. That was enough. Howland Reed arrived on the 7th day. He had come overland from the Neck, a long journey, made longer by winter, made longer still by the nature of the starting point, which was a castle that moved with the tides and did not appear on any map that could be trusted. Wyman's man had found him nonetheless, which said something about the man Wyman had sent, and something about how thoroughly Wyman had prepared for this. The Lord of Greywater Watch rode in through the Eastwatch gate in the early afternoon, alone, except for 2 of his own men, and asked to be taken to the Lord Commander of the Night's Watch. Jon was sitting up by then, sitting up and dressed and deeply uncomfortable with both, but the Maester had told him that lying still would kill him as surely as the blades had nearly done, and Jon had spent enough of his life being told uncomfortable truths by people who knew better than him to recognize when to argue and when not to. So he sat up. He held the letter, which Wyman had left with him, and he had read it more times than he could count, and he was no closer to knowing what to do with what it said than he had been the first time. Howland Reed came in quietly. He was a man of middle years, weathered in the way of people who have spent their lives in wet and difficult country, and there was something about him that was very still, not the stillness of inaction, but the stillness of someone who has learned not to spend energy he does not need to spend. He looked at Jon the way Jon had noticed certain older men looking at him sometimes, with a recognition that seemed to go further than the surface, as though they were seeing something he could not see himself. "Lord Snow," Howland Reed said. "Just Snow," Jon said. It was habit by now. "Sit down if you like. I am told I cannot stand to greet you properly. I apologize for that." "There is nothing to apologize for." Howland sat in the chair beside the bed. "Lord Manderly sent for me. He said there was a letter." "There is." Jon held it up. "He tells me you were at the Tower of Joy." "I was." "With my father." Jon said the word carefully. He had been saying it carefully for 7 days, testing the weight of it against the new information, finding that it fit differently than it had before. "With Ned Stark." Howland Reed was quiet for a moment. In the corner of the room, Wyman Manderly sat in the largest chair that Eastwatch had been able to produce, which was still not large enough for him. He had said when he arrived that he intended to remain and say nothing, and he had kept to that. He sat with his hands folded on his belly and his eyes open and his mouth closed, and he might have been sleeping except that his eyes moved. "With Eddard Stark," Howland said. "Yes. There were 7 of us who rode to that tower. 3 knights of the King's Guard held it. Sir Gerald Hightower, Sir Arthur Dane, and Sir Oswell Went. What followed was quick and costly. When it was over, 5 of our 7 were dead, and all 3 of theirs. You and Ned were the only ones left? Yes. A pause. Dane would have killed him. I prevented that. It is the only part of the story I tell with any pride. Jon looked at the letter. And inside. Howland Reed was quiet for a longer time. Outside, through the small window, the wind off the Bay of Seals pushed at the walls of Eastwatch with the persistent pressure of something that had been trying to get in for a very long time. Inside, Howland said, "There was your mother." The word settled into the room. Jon had known Lyanna Stark's name his whole life, the way everyone in the north knew it. As a story, as the spark that started a war, as the girl in the sad songs that Robert Baratheon had demanded, played again when he was deep in his wine. He had not known her as a word that applied to him. He was still learning the shape of it. She was dying, Howland said. She had been in that tower for months. There had been a child. He did not look away from Jon. She was dying, and she was afraid, and she asked Ned to make her a promise. He made it. I was in the room. I heard it. What was the promise? I do not know. Howland's voice was steady and quiet. I was there. I heard her say, "Promise me, Ned." I heard him give his word. I did not hear what the promise was, or if I heard it, I did not understand it, and I have wondered about it for 17 years. He folded his hands in his lap. I know only that when he gave his word, the fear left her eyes, and then she was gone. Jon was very still. And the child, he said, the child lived. You lived. Howland looked at him. Eddard Stark carried you north from the mountains of Dawn and told the world you were his. He told your mother's betrothed, Robert Baratheon, who was king by then, that you were the product of some wartime liaison, and Robert believed him, or chose to believe him, which amounts to the same thing, and Ned said nothing else to anyone for as long as he lived. He never told me, Jon said. No. He had 17 years. He had chances. The words were not quite anger, and not quite grief. They were something that lives between the two, in the country where people go when someone they loved has lied to them for reasons they cannot entirely condemn. He never told me. I know, Howland said. Can you tell me why? Howland was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, it was carefully. I cannot speak for what Ned Stark thought or felt. I can only tell you what I observed, which is that he was a man who kept his oaths even when the cost of keeping them was very high. He promised something to a dying girl who was afraid for her son, and he kept the promise. What the promise cost him, what it cost you, is not something I can account for. A pause. I do not think he was indifferent to what it cost you. I think he was a man who had made a choice and could not find a way back from it, and every year that passed made the way back harder. Jon held the letter. He held it with both hands, the way he might hold something that had been given to him before he was certain he wanted it. Outside, the Bay of Seals moved against the shore in the way it had always moved, without consulting anyone about whether the timing was convenient. She wrote this, Jon said, before he arrived. She wrote it not knowing if anyone would ever find it. That is what Lord Manderly tells me. She was afraid I would not survive. She was afraid no one would know. He looked at the paper. She was 16 years old. Thereabouts, Howland said. Yes. The room held the weight of that. A girl of 16 in a tower in the mountains of Dawn, afraid for a child she had not yet fully brought into the world, writing words on paper, because words on paper were the only thing that might outlast her. It was a particular kind of courage. Not the courage of battles, which is loud and immediate, but the quiet courage of someone who acts knowing that they will not be present to see whether the action mattered. It had mattered. It had taken 17 years, but it had mattered. "There is a man named Wyman Manderly in the corner of this room," Jon said, "who has sailed a fleet of war galleys from White Harbour to tell me I am the son of Rhaegar Targaryen." "Yes," Howland said, "and you are telling me he is right." "I am telling you what I witnessed," Howland said. "Your mother named the father. She was present. I have no reason to doubt her, and every reason to believe the evidence of my own eyes, which told me, the moment I walked into this room, that I was looking at a Stark." He paused. "The rest of what you are is not mine to speak to, but the Stark part I can confirm." From the corner, Wyman Manderly said nothing. He had promised to say nothing, and he was a man who kept his promises, even when keeping them was difficult. He sat with his hands folded on his belly and let the Lord of Greywater Watch do the work that only the Lord of Greywater Watch could do. Howland Reed finished. Jon held the letter. The fire at the wall burned steadily, and outside the window the Bay of Seals was grey and cold and full of ships. 23 war galleys riding at anchor, patient as everything that has already travelled a long way and is willing to wait a little longer. They had crossed the Bight in winter for this. They were in no hurry now. Jon looked at the letter for a long time. No one asked him to decide anything. No one asked him to be anything. The room simply held the facts, which were large and old and did not care whether he was ready for them, and Jon Snow held the letter his mother had written when she was afraid, and outside the fleet waited, and the North remembered, and the question of what happened next could wait until tomorrow. Tonight was enough. Tonight was, in its terrible and unexpected way, almost enough. The rider came into Eastwatch on the 10th day, half frozen, and riding a horse that looked no better. He was one of Wyman's household men, left behind in White Harbour when the fleet sailed, one of a small number tasked with watching, listening, and sending word when word was needed. He had ridden north in winter, which was not a thing a man did lightly, and the fact that he had done it meant the word was needed. Wyman received him in the small room that Eastwatch's steward had given over for his use. The man thawed by the fire and delivered his report in the flat, direct way of someone who has been carefully trained to remember what he observes and transmit it without embellishment. Roose Bolton knew the fleet was gone. He had known for 5 days, by the rider's count. Word had reached Winterfell, whether through the city's eyes or through a faster route, the man could not say, and the response from the Warden of the North had been immediate and methodical. Ravens had gone south toward King's Landing. Riders had gone to the Lords of the North, who still held to the Bolton banner, with messages the rider had not been able to read, but could guess at from the speed and manner of their sending. There had been no attempt to march on the coast, which the rider attributed to the weather, and to the more immediate pressure from the west, where Stannis Baratheon continued his march. Wyman thanked the man, gave him food and a place to sleep, and sat alone. He had expected this. He had always expected it. The only question had been the timing, and the timing was what it was. 5 days was enough for Bolton to have sent ravens, but not enough for the ravens to have returned with a response. Whatever the Iron Throne decided to do, it had not yet decided. The window was still open. He thought about Roose Bolton. He had known the man, at a distance, in the way that northern lords know each other, from councils and assemblies, and the particular occasions when the great houses of the north were required to occupy the same room. Roose Bolton was not a man who made himself easy to know. He was quiet, pale-eyed, deliberate in the way of a man who understands that most mistakes are made by people who moved too quickly. He had betrayed his king at a wedding feast, and had done it so cleanly that no one who needed to object survived long enough to do so. That was not a small thing. It required patience and precision, and a particular absence of sentiment that most men couldn't sustain, even if they wished to. Wyman respected him the way he respected all genuinely dangerous things, which was seriously and without warmth. But Rose Bolton had no ships. That was the fact at the center of the matter. He held Winterfell, which was inland. He held it with his own forces, and with whatever northern bannermen had come to the wedding, and he held it with the legitimacy of the Iron Throne's appointment and the paper that named him Warden of the North. He could send ravens south, and he could move riders east, but the sea was not available to him. The sea had belonged to White Harbor for generations, and White Harbor had sailed its sea northward, and there was nothing Roose Bolton could do about that from inside a ruined castle in the middle of a winter that was killing men who simply tried to march through it. And Stannis Baratheon was already in the Wolf's Wood, pressing on Winterfell from the west. Wyman permitted himself a moment of something that was not quite satisfaction. Bolton was caught between two pressures that he had not anticipated in the same season, and being caught between two pressures that one did not anticipate was, in his experience, the most effective way to be caught. It did not guarantee anything. Rose Bolton was capable enough to make difficult situations into survivable ones, but it was not the position a man wanted to be in. The problem was not Bolton. The problem, the one that Wyman had been sitting with since before the fleet sailed, the one that had not diminished in the days since, was what happened when the Iron Throne responded. Bolton had sent ravens south. The Iron Throne would receive them. And the Iron Throne, whatever its present composition and whatever its present preoccupations, would not simply ignore a northern lord sailing a war fleet to crown a rival claimant in defiance of their appointed warden. He called his officers together that evening and said it plainly. "We are not only defying Bolton," he told them, in the small room with the fire and the wind at the walls. "We are defying the Iron Throne. Bolton is their man in the north. When we move against Bolton, we are moving against the authority that placed him. I want you to understand this clearly, because the consequences of it are different from the consequences of a northern quarrel. Bolton is a problem for the North. The Iron Throne is a problem for everyone." The officers listened. Some of them had known this already, in the way that people know things they have not looked at directly. Saying it aloud was different. "Then why are we doing it?" asked his captain, who was a direct man and had always been willing to ask the question that others were thinking. "Because the North has named its own kings before," Wyman said. "Robb Stark was proclaimed king in the North without the South's permission or approval, by the lords of the North in a hall, by acclamation, because the North decided it was necessary. Before Robb, there were 300 years of kings in the North who did not consult the South about their right to rule. The North is not a subject of the Iron Throne because the Iron Throne has decided it is. It is a subject because it once chose to kneel, and choosing can be revised." He paused. "What we are doing has been done before. It has costs. I am not pretending otherwise. But the question of whether it can be done has been answered by the history of the very land we are trying to reclaim." The room was quiet. "The Iron Throne has its problems," Wyman continued. "It has wars and debts and a child on it, or had, the last I heard anything reliable. It has the whole of the South to manage, and the South is not manageable even in the best of seasons. The North is far, and winter is here, and by the time any southern force could march north, the question may already have been answered. He looked at each of them. We are not safe. I am not telling you we are safe. I am telling you that the danger is real and named, and we proceed anyway. He did not take a vote. He was a lord, and lords did not take votes. He announced a decision. The decision was the same decision it had been when the fleet left White Harbour, which was the same decision it had been when he read a dead girl's letter in the grey morning light by a harbour window. Nothing had changed the decision. Nothing had reduced it. The danger had been named, and naming it was important, and they would proceed with their eyes open. They dispersed. The fire burned. The cold worked at the walls of Eastwatch with the patience it always had. Wyman sat alone for a time and thought about Rose Bolton at Winterfell, in the ruins that his son had helped create, with his ravens gone south and his eyes looking east at a sea he did not command. He thought about the Iron Throne's response, which would come eventually, and which would require answering when it came. He thought about the distance between eventually and now, which was presently his greatest asset. The North remembered, and the North, at the moment, had the sea. That would have to be enough. The Wolf's Wood in winter was a place that had stopped pretending to welcome anyone. Jon rode through it on the 14th day after Eastwatch, with 2 brothers as his escort, and the cold at his back like a hand pushing him forward. His wounds had closed, not healed. The Maester had been plain about that, and equally plain that riding was inadvisable. But he had decided that inadvisable and impossible were different things, and he had enough determination to cross that distance, born of necessity and of the need to be doing something rather than lying still thinking about dead mothers and fathers who were not his fathers. The crofters' village appeared through the trees in the late afternoon, which in winter meant the light was already failing. He smelled it before he saw it. Cook fires, horses, the dense human smell of an army that has been camping in the same place long enough to have opinions about it. Then the trees thinned, and the village opened before him, a scattering of stone buildings, half of them commandeered for shelter, and between the buildings a field of tents and fires and men who moved with the particular economy of people conserving warmth. 5,000 men, or what remained of 5,000 men, after a march through a northern winter that had not been a kindness to anyone. They were alive. Some of them were barely alive. But they were there. He was met at the edge of the camp by men who knew how to hold a spear and had questions about who he was. He told them. The name moved through the camp ahead of him. Stannis Baratheon was in the largest building in the village, which was not large. He stood at a table covered with maps when Jon came in, and he looked up, and for a moment the 2 of them simply looked at each other across the low-ceilinged room with its smoking fire and its smell of wet wool and pine resin. Jon had been told, over the years, various things about Stannis Baratheon. He was hard. He was fair. He did not forgive easily, and he did not forget at all, and he held to the law with the kind of conviction that made men uncomfortable even when the law was on their side. He was not a warm man. He was not a man who was trying to be warm. He stood at his table in a room that was barely above freezing and looked at Jon Snow with eyes that were evaluating and measuring and arriving at preliminary conclusions that would be revised only on the basis of evidence. "Lord Snow," Stannis said. "Your Grace," Jon replied. He had debated this on the ride south. Courtesy was not the same as capitulation, and beginning with an insult would serve no one. Stannis gestured to a chair. Jon sat. Stannis remained standing, which was the kind of choice a man makes when he wants to be clear about certain things before the conversation starts. "You have come from Eastwatch," Stannis said. "I am told there is a Manderly fleet in the bay." There is. And I am told you have brought evidence of a claim. His voice held no particular inflection. It was the voice of a man who has heard many claims and evaluated most of them poorly. I have. Jon set the letter on the table. He had also brought Howland Reed's testimony, committed to writing at Eastwatch, signed by the Lord of Greywater Watch. He set that beside the letter. A letter written by Lyanna Stark in 283 AC, before she died, naming Rhaegar Targaryen as the father of her child. He paused. Her child was me. Stannis looked at the documents. He did not pick them up immediately. He looked at them the way he might look at a piece of ground before crossing it, assessing the surface for what might be hidden beneath. Lyanna Stark is dead, he said. She is. She cannot confirm what she wrote. No. But the Lord of Greywater Watch can. Howland Reed was at the Tower of Joy in 283 AC. He was one of 2 survivors. He was inside the tower when she died. He has written what he witnessed and signed it with his seal. Jon nodded toward the second document. I would ask you to read both before you respond. Stannis picked up the letter. He read it. His expression did not change in the way that would have been satisfying to watch, but something behind the expression changed. A slight adjustment, a recalibration. He set it down and picked up Howland Reed's account and read that too. He set it down. He was quiet for a moment. The Reed Lord has every reason to support a Stark claimant, Stannis said. His house has been sworn to Winterfell for generations. His testimony is not impartial. No testimony ever is, Jon said. A man who was there and has reason to want the truth to be what it is still a man who was there. You may disbelieve him if you choose. You may read what he wrote and conclude he is lying. But he is the only living person who witnessed those events, and I am asking you to hear him speak in person before you reach that conclusion. Stannis studied him. Jon didn't look away. He had spent enough of his life being looked at by men who were deciding what to make of him that he had learned how to be looked at without it becoming a contest. Even if everything in these documents is true, Stannis said, I am the rightful king of the 7 kingdoms. My brother Robert died, leaving no legitimate heir. His supposed sons were not his. The crown passes to me. No claim of Targaryen blood changes the line of succession in the way you appear to be suggesting. With respect, Jon said, the line of succession and the ability to hold what is claimed are 2 different things. You are marching 5,000 men through a winter that is killing them. Your army is a month behind where it expected to be, and several hundred men fewer than it left Deepwood Motte with. Roose Bolton sits in Winterfell with his own forces, and the Iron Throne's legitimacy and ravens going south as we speak. He kept his voice even. He was not trying to wound the man. He was trying to give him accurate information, which was what the man deserved. Divided, your forces and the Manderly fleet are 2 separate problems for Bolton to manage, one at a time. Together, they are a trap. You are proposing that I set aside my claim to the Iron Throne. I am proposing nothing of the kind. Jon met his eyes. I am not asking you to abandon anything. I am asking you to consider that the question of who holds the Iron Throne and the question of who holds the North may be separable questions, and that answering the second one first does not prevent you from answering the first one afterward. He paused. The North has had its own kings before. It had one recently. Whether it should have one now, and whether that king should be me, are questions I am not in a position to answer alone. But the North is not yours yet, Your Grace, and it is not Bolton's, whatever the paper says, and it will not belong to anyone if the army that might have taken it freezes in a village 2 days from Winterfell, while Bolton waits behind his walls? Stannis was quiet. He had a way of being quiet that was not passive. It was the quiet of a man who is processing, organizing, arriving at positions. Jon had known men who were loud when thinking and men who were silent, and the silent ones were usually more dangerous when they finished. "Robb Stark legitimized you," Stannis said finally, "before he died." "He did, in a sealed document. I cannot prove the document's present location, but the witnesses who signed it are known, and the signatures can be verified. Robb Stark was 16 years old when he died. He was king when he died. A king's act is a king's act regardless of the king's age." Stannis made a sound that was not quite agreement, and not quite dismissal. He turned back to the table and looked at the map, the Wolf's Wood, the road to Winterfell, the positions marked in ink that no longer quite matched the reality of where his army was. He was a man who dealt in realities. He did not love them when they were difficult, but he dealt in them. "I will hear the Reed Lord speak," he said. "Bring him here. I will listen to his account, and I will ask my own questions, and I will decide what I believe." He looked up from the map. "That is all I am agreeing to. Nothing more." "That is all I am asking," Jon said. They stood in the half-dark of the Crofters' building, with the dying fires outside, and the cold pressing in at every crack in the walls, and neither of them had won the argument, and neither of them had lost it, and they were still in the same room, which was more than they had been an hour ago. Outside, men moved between the fires, pulling their cloaks tighter. The north stretched in every direction, grey and white and vast, and somewhere in the middle of it, the question of its future sat waiting. The decision to continue talking was itself a kind of answer, and for tonight, it was enough. Howland Reed came to the Crofters' village the next morning, having ridden through the night. He came in quietly, as he did everything, and he asked for nothing except a chair and the chance to speak. Stannis granted him both. Jon Snow was present, seated to one side. He had said, before Howland arrived, that he would not speak unless asked. He kept to that. He sat with his hands on his knees and his grey eyes watching the room, and he said nothing. The three of them were alone in the building Stannis had taken for his headquarters. Outside, the army waited in the cold with the patience of men who have used up most of their impatience on a march that had already lasted longer than anyone planned. "Lord Reed," Stannis said, when they had settled, "you were at the Tower of Joy." "I was." Howland folded his hands in his lap. His voice was measured and steady, the voice of someone who has told a story before, internally if not aloud, and has learned which parts are essential and which can be abbreviated. In 283 AC, the war was ending. Rhaegar Targaryen had died on the Trident, and the city had fallen, and Eddard Stark rode south with 6 companions to find his sister. One of those companions was you. Yes. We were 7 in total. 3 knights of the Kingsguard held the tower: Sir Gerald Hightower, Sir Arthur Dane, and Sir Oswell Went. They had stayed when Rhaegar rode north. They stayed because they were Kingsguard, and that was what Kingsguard did. A pause. What followed was brief and costly. When it was over, 5 of our 7 were dead, and all 3 of theirs. Sir Arthur Dane was among them. He was. Howland said this without elaboration. There was a quality in the brevity that spoke to what Sir Arthur Dane had been, and to what it had cost to put him in the ground. "Lord Stark survived," Stannis said. "Eddard Stark and I were the only survivors, yes. He went inside. I followed." Howland looked at Stannis with the directness of a man who has decided not to soften what comes next. Inside the tower, there was a young woman in a bed of blood. Lyanna Stark. She was dying. There had been a child. He did not look at Jon. She asked her brother to make her a promise. He made it. I was present. I will not tell you what the promise was, because I do not know with certainty. I know that she said, "Promise me, Ned." And I know that when he gave his word, the fear left her eyes. And then she died. Stannis was quiet for a moment. "And the child," he said, "lived. Eddard Stark carried him north and raised him in Winterfell and named him Snow." Howland paused. "I have read the letter that was brought to me, the letter Lyanna Stark wrote before she died, naming Rhaegar Targaryen as the father of her child. I recognize the circumstances as consistent with what I witnessed. I cannot verify her handwriting. I had no prior acquaintance with it. But I can tell you that what the letter describes matches what I saw and heard in that tower, and that I have no reason to doubt it. A man supporting a Stark claimant might have many reasons to say exactly what you have said," Stannis observed. His voice was not hostile. It was the voice of a man examining a piece of evidence for weaknesses in the way that a careful smith examines a blade for flaws, not hoping to find them, but needing to know if they are there. "He might," Howland agreed. "I have no way to remove my own interest from the matter. I can only tell you what I witnessed. You must decide what to make of it." Stannis considered this for a long time. He stood, as he had stood the evening before, at the table with the maps on it, and he looked at the fire rather than at the men in the room, and the fire burned and said nothing useful. "If the boy's claim is legitimate," Stannis said, "then the Iron Throne situation is considerably more complicated than it was this morning." "Yes," Howland said. Robert Baratheon's claim rested on the argument that the Targaryen line had forfeited its right to rule through Aerys's madness and the rebellion that followed. That argument has a certain logic to it. It has less logic if there is a surviving Targaryen heir whose legitimacy is unimpeachable and whose blood includes the very house that led the rebellion against his father's house. Howland said nothing. He had learned, over a long life in difficult terrain, when to speak and when to let a man work through his own thinking. "The boy would have a stronger claim to the Iron Throne than I do," Stannis said. He said it flatly, as a man states an arithmetic result that he dislikes but cannot disprove. "If his parentage can be established." "That is possible," Howland said carefully. "It is not what I am here to argue." "What are you here to argue?" "Nothing. I am here to testify to what I witnessed. The conclusions are yours to draw." He paused. "I would say only this. There are questions about the Iron Throne and questions about the North, and they are not the same questions. The North has its own history. It has had its own kings. What is right for the North in this moment, and what is right for the Seven Kingdoms in the years ahead, may not require the same answer at the same time." Stannis was quiet again. He had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to men who are genuinely thinking rather than performing thought. No movement, no shifting, just the processing happening somewhere behind the eyes. Jon Snow, in his chair to the side, had not moved either. He was watching Stannis. He had the patience of someone who has learned that some battles are won by waiting. "I will tell you what I will do," Stannis said, "and what I will not do." He turned from the fire and looked at them both. "I will not name him king. I am the rightful king of the Seven Kingdoms, and I will not rescind that position or subordinate my claim to any other, living or dead." That is not a negotiating posture. It is the truth. He paused. I will also not oppose whatever the North chooses to do about its own king. The North's king and the Iron Throne's king have been different men before. They may be different men again. That is a question for the North to settle, and when it is settled, I will consider what it means for the larger question. He looked at Jon. I have marched here to take Winterfell from Bolton. That purpose does not change. Bolton is a traitor who murdered his king, and he will answer for it, and the North will be cleared of him regardless of what name is over its gates when the work is done. He looked at Howland. I have heard your testimony. I find it credible enough to take seriously. Whether I find it credible enough to be determinative is a question I will hold for now. It was not agreement. It was not the full denial it might have been. It was the specific and limited position of a man who has encountered evidence he cannot dismiss and has chosen the narrowest possible adjustment to his existing commitments, which was, Jon thought, probably as much as anyone who understood Stannis Baratheon had a right to expect. That is fair, Howland Reed said. The cold outside pressed at the walls. The fire worked at the room's chill with limited authority. 3 men sat in a space too small for the size of what they had been discussing, and none of them was fully satisfied with what had been said, and all of them understood that satisfaction was not the point. It was not alliance. It had not become alliance. What it was, carefully and exactly, was the absence of war between men who needed not to be at war with each other, which, in the North in winter, with Winterfell still in Bolton's hands and the distance to it measured in suffering, was the most practical thing any of them could have hoped for today. They went their separate ways in the grey morning, and the fires of the camp burned low, and the army of Stannis Baratheon began, slowly and with the grudging efficiency of a force that has been cold for too long, to break camp and resume its march. The fleet came south along the coast and then turned inland, up the White Knife. It could not sail to Winterfell. No one had suggested it could. Winterfell was inland, surrounded by the ruins of itself and the winter that pressed in from every direction. And the White Knife was a river, not a miracle. But the White Knife ran from the Bight deep into the north, and the fleet that sailed up it controlled the eastern supply corridor that any army holding Winterfell depended on when the Wolf's Wood roads became impassable. In winter, with Stannis Baratheon pressing from the west, those roads were already impassable, which meant that the eastern corridor was not a secondary concern for Bolton. It was the only corridor he had left. Wyman Manderly understood supply lines. He had been a lord of a harbour city for 30 years. He had watched what happened to armies that lost their supply lines in winter, and it was not complicated. They ate what they had, and then they ate the horses, and then they waited and grew weaker, and then they made bad decisions under pressure, and then they died or surrendered in whichever order the circumstances permitted. He did not need to bring his fleet to Winterfell's walls. He needed only to be present in the White Knife, in force, with no intention of leaving. He watched the river from the deck of his flagship, which was as far as he could see over the railing without assistance. The winter had settled on the water, the way it settled on everything in the north, completely, without apology, as though it had always been there, and the rest of the year was the intrusion. The oars moved steadily. The fleet moved with them. He thought of Wendell. He thought of his son the way he always thought of him now, not as a presence, not as the broad-shouldered, laughing man who had filled rooms with his appetite for life, but as an absence, a shape cut out of the world, a place where something had been and was no longer. He thought of the Red Wedding, of the twins, of a feast that had been a trap. He thought of the Freys who had killed his son, and who had afterward come to White Harbour with their smiles and their condolences and their political marriages, and how he had fed them and entertained them and smiled at them across the table. He did not think, specifically, about what he had brought to the wedding feast at Winterfell, the pies, the great meat pies, which he had eaten with considerable public enthusiasm. Some thoughts were better held loosely, without putting precise words to them. He permitted himself only what he had always permitted himself, the knowledge that accounts could be balanced, and patience was the instrument of balancing. He had been patient for a long time. He was running out of patience now, but only because it was no longer needed. In Winterfell, Roose Bolton sat with his ravens and his calculations, and the growing understanding that the situation had changed in ways he had not accounted for. He was not a man who panicked. Panic was for people who had not prepared for contingencies, and Roose Bolton had spent his adult life preparing for contingencies. When the news of the Manderly fleet reached him, ships in the White Knife, moving south with oars, not anchoring, moving, he had spent an hour in a cold room doing the arithmetic before saying anything to anyone. He had done the same when word came that Jon Snow was alive and had met with Stannis Baratheon in the Wolf's Wood, and that Stannis hadn't killed him and was now moving again. The arithmetic was not favourable. He had sent ravens south to King's Landing before the fleet arrived in the river, and the ravens had gone, and he was waiting for the responses that would determine whether the Iron Throne could act quickly enough to matter. He was not optimistic about this. Ravens took days in clear weather. In winter, with the uncertainty of every relay point between Winterfell and the capital, days became weeks. Whatever response came would come after the matter had already been decided one way or another. He had sent them anyway, because a man in his position used every tool he had, even the slow ones. The northern lords who had come for the wedding were a more immediate problem. Roose kept his own strength at Winterfell, his Bolton men, his loyal captains, the core of what had always been his. And he had always known that the northern bannermen who came for the wedding were not precisely his in the same way. They had come because they were required to come, or because they calculated that coming was safer than refusing, or because they had not yet found a better option. They were men of the north who had bent the knee to a Southron authority they did not love, and they had done so because the alternative had seemed worse. The alternative had now acquired a name and a face, and a letter and a living witness, and it was moving on Winterfell from two directions at once. He could see the arithmetic working on them. He could see it in the quality of their silences, in the messages they exchanged with each other in halls that went suddenly quiet when he entered, in the particular way that men who are reconsidering their positions move through a space, with a careful attention to exits, with a new thoughtfulness about where they stood in relation to everyone else. He had done this himself, in other men's halls, in earlier years. He recognized it. He was not without resources. He had his men, and his walls, such as they were, and the natural advantages of a position that had to be attacked rather than simply surrounded. He had the Iron Throne's authority, and the paper that named him Warden of the North, which was worth something even now. Not as much as it had been worth when the only alternatives were dead or absent, but something. He had the winter itself, which was as hard on armies attacking as it was on armies defending. What he did not have was time. Time was the thing that a man in his position needed most, and time was moving against him with every day the fleet stayed in the river, and every mile Stannis' army advanced through the Wolf's Wood. The window in which he could respond effectively, in which help from the south could arrive and be useful, in which the northern bannermen had not yet made their final calculations, That window was closing. He could feel it closing, the way you feel a room getting colder when the fire has been allowed to burn too low. He did what a careful man does when his options are narrowing. He identified the ones that remained and ranked them by their costs and probabilities, and he prepared himself to move when the moment came that required movement. He did not despair. Despair was as useless as panic, and he had never had much patience for useless things. But he looked at the maps in his cold room, with Stannis to the west and the Manderly fleet to the east, and a castle full of men who were quietly reconsidering where their futures lay, and he acknowledged privately that the situation had been managed better by his enemies than he would have managed it himself if their positions had been reversed. He gave credit where it was due. The fat lord of White Harbour had played a long and careful game, and the pieces were now where they needed to be. Wyman Manderly on the river thought, "The net is closing." He did not say it aloud. He sat in his chair on the deck of his flagship, too large to stand comfortably on a moving vessel, and he watched the white knife move past on both sides, and he held Wendell in the locked room where he kept him, and he watched the trees and the water and the grey winter sky, and he permitted himself, carefully, in the privacy of his own mind, something that was almost satisfaction. Almost. Not quite. Not until the gates of Winterfell stood open, and what needed to be done in there was done. But almost. Rose Bolton left Winterfell on a grey morning, with a small company of riders, and the careful precision of a man who has identified the moment before a position becomes indefensible and chosen to move while movement was still possible. He did not surrender. He simply calculated that the white knife was closed, that Stannis Baratheon's army was close enough to make defense a matter of attrition he would lose, and that the northern lords under his roof had made their own calculations, and those calculations did not favor him. He left in the dark and rode east, and by the time anyone understood he was gone, he was already beyond reach. The castle fell without falling. The gates opened. The Bolton men who remained, without their lord, found that their options had narrowed to two and chose the one that kept them breathing. Jon Snow entered Winterfell on foot. He had thought it would feel like coming home. It did not. It felt like standing in the place where a home had been. The walls that had once stood here reduced to a ruin in the process of partial repair, stone heaped against stone, scaffolding against old walls. He walked through the yard where he had learned to fight, and the godswood where the ancient heart tree still stood, its carved face watching him with the expression it had always worn, which was no expression at all. Howland Reed was beside him in the yard, quiet as he always was. Wyman Manderly had been brought up from the river in his litter, a process that had taken most of the morning and required considerable organization, and was now installed inside the great hall in the largest chair that could be found on short notice. The northern lords who had broken from Bolton were gathering, not many of them, not yet, but enough. Enough to constitute a thing. Jon stood in the yard for a long time before he went inside. He thought about Ned Stark, who had stood in this same yard, who had brought an infant down from the mountains of Dawn and raised him here and never explained why. That silence had been the longest and heaviest he had ever lived inside, and he understood it now the way you understand a thing that has ended, with something between forgiveness and grief. Not quite either. Ned had made a promise and kept it. The costs were real, and he held them alongside everything else. He went inside. The great hall smelled of old smoke and cold stone and the winter that had settled into the walls as though it intended to stay. The lords stood when he entered, which he had not asked them to do. He walked to the front of the hall and stood there, and Wyman Manderly heaved himself upright in his great chair, which took effort and several auxiliary men, and when he was standing, braced and immense, sweating slightly despite the cold, he held the letter up where the hall could see it. "Lords of the North," Wyman said. His voice filled the hall the way only a very large man's voice can, not through force, but through mass. "I am Wyman Manderly, Lord of White Harbour. I brought this letter out of a locked chest in a warehouse by the harbour, and I sailed a fleet of war galleys through winter seas to put it in the hands of the man it was written for. And I am going to read it to you now, and I am going to tell you what it means. And then this hall is going to do what halls like this one do." He read it. The hall was very quiet. He read it in the flat, deliberate way of a man who knows that the words themselves are sufficient and does not require embellishment. He read Lyanna Stark's name. He read the name she had written beside the child's. He read the fear that had moved her hand across the paper 17 years ago in a tower she had not left alive. When he finished, he lowered the letter. "Robb Stark named this man his heir," he said. "He put his seal to it. The Lord of Greywater Watch, who was at the Tower of Joy in 283 AC, who held Lyanna Stark's hand when it was over, has given his testimony to this hall and this letter both. You know what that means. You know what it means when a man stands before you, with Stark blood and Targaryen blood, and a dead king's legitimacy, and a living witness, and a letter from a girl who was afraid for him and tried to protect him the only way she had left." He looked at them all in turn, the broad, slow sweep of a man who has been in too many halls to be impressed by any particular one. "The North remembers, my lords. The North remembers, and the Mummer's farce is almost done." In the silence that followed, a lord spoke. Then another. Then the third, and the fourth, and the rest of them, in the way that these things go when they go, not all at once but in a cascade, each voice making it easier for the next, the hall filling with the sound of men saying a name. Jon Snow stood at the front of the hall and received it. He did not look triumphant. He was 17 years old, or close enough, and he had been stabbed by his own brothers and told he was not who he had believed himself to be, and ridden south in winter with healing wounds to argue his case before a man who regarded him as a rival, and the man who had raised him was dead, and the mother who had been afraid for him was dead, and his father was dead, and what he was standing in was a ruin. He stood in it anyway, with his dark hair and his grey, stark eyes, and he accepted what the hall was offering him in the way that a person accepts a heavy thing, not with happiness, but with the understanding that some things are yours to carry and you do not refuse them. He was the son of Rhaegar Targaryen, who had wanted something, had wanted it enough to set a war in motion, had wanted it enough to leave Lyanna in a tower with 3 of the finest swords in the world to guard her while he rode to die for what he believed was necessary. And he was the son of Lyanna Stark, who had been afraid for her child and had written a letter and trusted a stranger to carry it north. Both of them were gone. The letter remained. He remained. That was what they had given him, between the two of them, whatever this was. He said what was required. He did not say more. The hall answered. In the back of the hall, against the wall, Howland Reed stood and watched. He had been at the beginning of this, in a room that smelled of blood and roses, in a different year. He was here at the end of a beginning. He made no sound. He required nothing of the moment except to witness it, which was what he had always done. Stannis Baratheon was not in the hall. He was in the Wolfswood with his army, still marching, not present and not pretending to be. He had kept his word in the way he kept all his words, precisely and entirely, not 1 degree beyond what he had agreed to. He had said he would not oppose the crowning, and he didn't oppose it, and his absence from the hall was the exact shape of what not opposing looked like. Wyman Manderly watched Jon Snow receive the oaths of the Lords of the North and thought of Wendell, who should have seen this, who had died at a feast table when it was not his time. He thought of his granddaughter Willa, 15 or 16 years old in White Harbour, betrothed to a Frey as part of an accommodation that was now dissolved along with everything else that had held the mummers fast together. He thought of the words he had said in a secret room in his own new castle, to a man he had trusted with his life and his purpose. The North remembers, Lord Davos. The North remembers, and the mummers' farce is almost done. Done now. Finally done. Outside, through the high windows of the great hall, the winter sky was iron grey and gave nothing away. Somewhere to the south, the Iron Throne sat behind its walls of swords, unaware as yet of what the North had decided. Somewhere to the east, a girl of 15 with 3 dragons ruled cities she had not been born for. Somewhere in the neck, a lord with a floating castle would ride back into the swamp and say nothing to anyone about what he had witnessed, because nothing he said would add anything to what had already been done. And in White Harbour, on the eastern shore of the White Knife, where it met the Bight, an empty harbour waited for the fleet to come home. The story did not end there. Stories like this did not end in great halls, with oaths and firelight and the sound of lords saying a name. They ended, if they ended, somewhere further out, in the difficult country between what had been decided and what would actually come of it, which was where all the real work happened. But this was where it began. This was, in the grey winter light of a ruined castle and a hall full of northern lords who had remembered what they were, the beginning of the answer to a question that had been waiting 17 years for someone to ask it. The North remembered.